We all need to invest. Nobody knows what the future holds, but a typical lifetime comes with some major expenses. There's housing, of course. Weddings, funerals, operations, holidays, children's education, and cars. But most important of all, there's retirement. Unfortunately, very few South Africans manage to save sufficiently during their working lives. And added to this, the average lifespan among healthy, financially literate university graduates has risen to 88 years. And the number of people living to 100 continues to grow. People leaving work today typically spend 20 years or more in retirement. That's a very long time to last without a regular salary. So how should we invest? How do we give ourselves the very best chance of achieving our financial goals? At the very least, how do we ensure that we don't run out of money before we die, leaving us to rely on our loved ones or the state for financial support? Historically, the biggest investment returns have come from owning shares in companies or equities. A team from London Business School has carried out a detailed study into the performance of different asset classes around the world since 1900. It found that over the long term, shares are the runaway winner. Their findings are summarized in a book called Triumph of the Optimists.
If you plot through the history, using the work that I've done with my London Business School colleagues, Paul Marsh and Mike Staunton, where we've looked at the performance of individual stock markets. We've now got data for 23 different markets running from 1900 with data up to 2015. Some of those markets prospered on the way in a direction that was largely going upwards and onwards, although there were some setbacks. We called it Triumph of the Optimists because our view was that back in 1900, only real optimists would have poured their money into industrial and commercial common stocks, and that many risk-averse investors would have played safe with government securities. It was the optimists, the people who were not frightened, who performed very well.
So let's look at the figures for South Africa. According to Professor Dimson and his team, between 1900 and 2016, cash has delivered an annualized real return, in other words, adjusted for the effects of inflation, of 1%. Bonds have returned 1.7%, but shares have produced an average annual return of 7.1%. In fact, South Africa has been one of the better performing markets globally over the period. The annualized real return on South African equities between 1967 and 2016 was even better, at 7.5%. You could, if you wanted to, invest your money yourself by investing in individual stocks, but the transactional fees and costs would be considerable. It would also be very time-consuming monitoring the individual performance of your stocks in the portfolio. Most investors give their money to professional stock pickers who actively manage their money for them. Mark Hebner is a financial advisor and investment author based in California.
So active investing has to do with an investment strategy where an individual or a fund manager is trying to beat a market. I say a market because there are many different markets in this world, international, US, even bond markets. And so they try to engage in different strategies such as picking stocks, trying to time the market, trying to select managers who will do one of those things and beat the market. And lastly, trying to choose an investment style that they think will have the best return at some near-term future. In essence, it's speculation versus investing, and it's actually a very bad idea because we have mountains of evidence that says that none of those things actually work.
There have been several detailed studies of active fund performance in developed markets. David Blake, of the Pensions Institute in the UK, explains how only a tiny proportion of active managers outperform long-term after costs.
The evidence shows, both for the UK and the US, if we're talking about mutual funds in particular, that a very small proportion, around about 1%, outperform in the long term on a risk and cost-adjusted basis. So 99% of fund managers deliver negative value added for their consumers once you take into account the fees that they charge.
Another problem active investors face is that a large number of funds are what are called closet trackers. In other words, although they claim to be actively managed, they broadly track the whole market. After costs, they're almost guaranteed to underperform. To beat the market, an active manager needs to show conviction, but they're just as likely to be wrong as they are to be right. And just because they've been right in the past doesn't mean they'll continue to be right in the future. Distinguishing genuine skill from pure luck is extremely difficult.
If you put a large number of monkeys on a large number of typewriters for a large amount of time, one of them will type out to be or not to be. But you don't necessarily hire that monkey to write your next play. I mean, my work, which applies partly to the US, sometimes to the UK, and also to Germany, suggests about 70% of funds are just closet trackers. So you're paying them a fee for something that you could really do yourself. About 20% your grandma could do better than them, so they actually remove value from the investment process. And about 5% probably are skilled managers. But having said that, they are probably harder to find than the Higgs boson.
The findings of Professors Blake and Cuthbertson are backed by SPIVA, the S&P Index versus Active Scorecard. SPIVA confirms that most managers underperform most of the time, and that persistent outperformance is extremely rare. This is the case globally and in South Africa.
SPIVA is a report that we put out globally to 8 countries or 8 regions. We've done this since 2002 for the US, and we started in South Africa around 2015. SPIVA really looks at how does actively managed funds compare to their traditional benchmarks or indices over various periods. So in the South African context, we've actually seen that the results are no different to our international results. We're probably about 80 to 90% of fund managers or funds would typically underperform a benchmark in the equity space. We also have a persistency scorecard that measures how these funds perform year after year. And we can see that looking at top quartile fund managers, they actually decline, that only around 1 to 2% of these fund managers stay in the top quartile over a 5-year period.
This begs the question, why do active funds generally perform so poorly? Well, central to the challenge is that active management is a zero-sum game. For one manager to win, another must lose. And because the industry has grown in size, it's become increasingly difficult for a single manager to consistently outperform their peers.
And the problem for most people, I think, is they just don't recognize, not paying attention to, how very many people there are who use the same kind of computers, have access to the same kind of staff, have Mike Bloomberg's wonderful system for gathering data and information any way you want it, use the same securities analysis and same securities research, get the same information from all the companies because regulators require it, so that they're par equal, and a whole bunch of different really important factors that 50, 40, 30 years ago really differentiated the winners from the others. But now it's not a differentiation because everybody has it.
Another question you might be asking is why so many investors still choose to use actively managed funds in the face of all this evidence, that after fees and charges, only a few of them manage to beat the market. One reason is that the active fund industry is extremely lucrative, and firms have huge budgets to spend on PR and advertising. Investors are often charmed into the belief that managers can beat the market. This would be based on past performance and likely over a much shorter period. But there's no guarantee that this can be repeated. There's a rising wave of discontent from advisors to retail investors as active managers appear to be inconsistent with their promise to outperform the market. Thankfully, for these investors, there are alternatives. Hello, I'm on my way. One of the biggest developments in the investment industry in recent years has been the growth in popularity of passive investing. Instead of paying to have their money actively managed, investors are increasingly opting for index funds, which are considerably cheaper. Hi, how are you? And aim to capture the returns of an entire market by tracking an index.
Yeah, the term passive investing, I think it's not a very good term for most people to understand, because it sounds like you're standing in the corner, or you're not participating, or you're somehow missing out. And that's bringing, that evokes emotions, negative emotions. I like to call, rather than call it passive investing, I call it smart investing, the kind of no regrets investing, where I've minimised the moving parts, I've minimised the decisions I have to make, I've minimised the cost, and I've maximised the chance of me getting the returns from capitalism, which are there for the taking. A passive portfolio can go down just as well as it can go up. And people talk about when stock markets are racing, that's great, but what about when they fall? Well, active funds fall, if not the same, if not more, because of the bets that they're taking. But I think rather than use the word passive, let's use the word smart investing. And what is smart investing? Smart investing is minimising the moving parts and maximising the chance and the amount that you're going to get from participating as an investor in capitalism.
Broadly speaking, the case for passive investing is based on two related market theories, the random walk and the efficient market hypothesis.
The random walk hypothesis is really crucial for investors to understand. It in essence says that the current price includes all the information we currently know and actually the impact of that information on the future. And so what that really says is now the change in price in the future has to do with new information that is random and unpredictable by definition. Nobody knows tomorrow's news. So efficient markets has to do again with this idea that all the known information and news is currently embedded in the stock market prices. And the real implication of that is that prices are fair.
If you agree that markets are mostly efficient and that future price movements are unpredictable, index funds are the logical choice. But the biggest advantage of using them is the cost. You could buy an index fund for about 20 basis points. That's another way of saying about a fifth of 1%. For an active fund, you could be looking at management fees of anything between 75 to 100 basis points. But with transaction fees, costs, and additional charges, you could easily be paying up to 200 basis points. That's 10 times the cost of an index fund. Over the course of an investing lifetime, that can make a huge difference.
We talk about the power of compounding, and of course on the positive side, the compounding of investment returns is great, but costs also compound, and they compound to the negative side. So the bigger the costs, the bigger the negative impact on the ultimate investment value over time. I like to think about this in terms of what proportion is my costs of the total investment return that I get. Because in days when we achieved 20 to 30% returns in our market, it was almost easy to absorb 2 to 3% costs. But where we are now now single-digit returns, suddenly those 2 to 3% returns are a big chunk out of the ultimate investment return that you compound over time. And that's why costs are even more important in a low-return environment.
Cost is really the only known when investing. You know what you're going to pay, you don't know what you're going to get. We've done work both locally and globally, and the thesis holds true for both. In the local market, there's a very clear relationship between the amount that you pay for investment and the subsequent performance. The lower the cost, the better the subsequent performance has been.
In the US, there have been huge outflows of money from actively managed funds and into low-cost index funds. In South Africa too, more and more investors are now choosing to take the passive route as concern grows about the performance of active managers and the industry's unwillingness to introduce lower, more transparent fees for active funds.
Finally, what does the world's most famous active investor, Warren Buffett, make of index funds? He loves them.
In his February 2017 letter to Berkshire Hathaway shareholders, he was hugely critical of active managers, hedge fund managers in particular, and of the fees they charge. Both large and small investors, he said, should stick with low-cost index funds.
So far, we've covered two types of investing. Active investing, generating market return through stock selection and market timing, commonly referred to as generating alpha in the market. On the other hand, there's passive investing, simply capturing market return, referred to as beta, at a much more cost-effective level. But there is a third way, a halfway house, known as factor investing.
Sometimes referred to as a smart, strategic, or alternative beta, factor investing is based on the multi-factor model developed by two American academics, the Nobel laureate Eugene Fama and his colleague Kenneth French.
The multi-factor model took the equity returns of stocks and carved them up into slices, basically looking at the size of the companies and a value growth metric. And so by dividing up the market into these slices and looking at the returns of these different slices, academics, and primarily Fama and French, uncovered that there had been higher returns among small companies and among value companies. And then when you blended that, you even had a combination of these factors for even higher returns.
Eric Chabini of the prestigious French business school EDIC and their index venture Scientific Beta explains further.
Factors are just a simple way to group stocks together by a common characteristic. So for example, the value factor is a grouping of stocks with a low valuation ratio into a single portfolio. The valuation ratio in this case would be represented by the stock's price to book ratio. Now, what is interesting about these factor portfolios is that their stocks are exposed to a common kind of risk, a risk that is well rewarded, better rewarded than a market index.
Factor investing has received significant attention over recent years. A few hundred factors have been researched. So how does one approach factor investing when there's just so much choice?
Here, we turn to the academic evidence. It takes a long time to establish a consensus that a risk factor will be well rewarded. This evidence is often based on a long-term analysis of equity markets that stretches back 60 to 80 years. This empirical analysis is not just conducted in one market, but across all international markets, including emerging markets. In equity markets, there are only a handful of factors that expose investors to certain kinds of risks that are well rewarded. These factors are value, momentum, size, low volatility, high profitability, and lower investment.
So are factor strategies a good idea? Factor-based funds are slightly more expensive than conventional passive funds, but if you're willing to be patient, then yes, they can make sense. What you must remember about these different factors is that whilst they are expected to generate higher returns, there is a price to pay in the form of greater risk.
Many investors are too impatient. They expect outperformance far more quickly than is reasonable.
All of the factors, consensual factors, are rewarded over long periods of time. However, what investors often misconstrue is that in the short term, these factors should be rewarded. And so they lack the patience to hold the factors through their cycle.
But what is important to bear in mind is that the reward to these risk factors doesn't come every day, every week, or even every year. Investors have to be very patient to benefit from the rewards to these types of factor portfolios. Often, they have to wait for a whole economic cycle.
Some have questioned whether factors are as applicable in smaller markets like South Africa.
Factors isn't something new to the South African market. We've seen that the active managers have typically branded themselves as value managers or quality managers. We just now have the index version of those available to the market.
The evidence that we've looked at in the South African market would suggest that factors do indeed have the same application in our local market as they do abroad in global markets. However, investors should be cognizant of the fact that in our local market being more concentrated and less diverse, there may be single stock or sector idiosyncratic risk that relates to factor-based investing in our markets.
The issue of cyclicality and sector concentration has largely been addressed through the creation of one strategy which holds all the factors, known as multi-factor.
Multi-factor approach to investing looks at harnessing all of the factors simultaneously. And what this means for an investor is that rather than being exposed to one factor and in turn potentially to one sector or to one share, we diversify across the factors and then of course in turn to the sectors and individual shares. So we get a more diversified outcome in our local markets.
It's also important to bear in mind that since a single factor portfolio can suffer underperformance for a prolonged period of time, investors benefit from investing in a number of different factors to smooth out performance over time.
So when deciding how to invest, the most important thing is to avoid high-cost, actively managed funds, certainly when investing in equities. The evidence clearly shows that the best approach is a combination of passive and factor investing, both important parts of an evidence-based investing approach.
By choosing this route, you're far more likely to have a successful experience in investing.
There's no getting away from the fact that whatever investment strategy you choose, it's bound to involve at least a degree of risk.
People are often much happier discussing investment returns, but it's essential before you make any investment decision that you fully understand any risk you might be taking.
Risk and return are in fact directly related to each other. The returns you receive are a reward for the risk you take. That doesn't mean that taking risk guarantees a positive return. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a risk at all. But you can't expect your money to grow unless you're prepared to accept the possibility that you might lose money, at least for the short term.
This relationship between risk and return has to do with the uncertainty of the return and then the price that a willing buyer is willing to pay based on that uncertainty. So let's assume I have an investment that we would expect to earn 10% a year, and you want to buy that from me. One of the first things you want to know is how certain is that 10%. And the more risk or uncertainty associated with that 10%, the lower the price that you would be willing to pay for that investment.
There are several different types of risk involved when it comes to investing, not the least of which is that you don't take on enough risk. In other words, the risk of not meeting your objectives is far more important than short-term variability in returns.
The main risk for most people is the failure to achieve their desired lifestyle and other important goals. That's the number one risk that you need to be thinking of, and everything has to be judged in relation to that. If you can achieve all your goals by leaving all your money in cash under cautious assumptions, then why bother investing? But most people in the real world haven't got overfunded pensions, haven't got more cash than they need, haven't got quite enough, or don't want to save enough, or don't want to continue working until they're 100. So for those people, the risk for them is that they're going to live beyond their capital, and or that inflation is going to erode the purchasing power of their capital, or that taxes or some other catastrophe is going to destroy their wealth and take their wealth from them. But there are other risks as well. There's risks that you've got your money invested in something or in a bank account or in investments, and there's a fraud and someone runs off with your money, or there's a failure of a financial institution. That's called counterparty risk. And then the other risk, of course, is that you've got illiquid funds, but you need to spend them and you can't get your hands on them, in which case that will force you to actually borrow money and pay someone a premium for doing so.
One of the biggest risks investors face is market risk. In other words, the risk that the market will fall heavily and that you need to access your money before it recovers. But market volatility is part and parcel of investing in the stock market. Assuming your time horizon is long enough, you shouldn't really see this as a risk at all.
The biggest risk in an individual's life is that they don't have enough money to fund their financial objectives, be it their retirement or their education or even short-term expenses like emergency funds, for example. The risk that an investor will lose capital permanently by investing in the equity market is actually much lower than investors believe. If we look again back at using actual market data, over the last 115 years, if you'd invested for 1 year at any period over the last 115 years, there would have been about a 30% chance that you'd ended up with less than you started. However, the real magic happens when you invest for longer periods of time in the equity market. So investing for a period of 5 years, there really is a less than 10% chance that you would have ended up with less than you started. Over a 10-year investment period, there is less than a 1% chance, using historical data, that you would have ended up with less than you started.
Another common type of risk is being too concentrated. Even in a bull market, the price of an individual stock can fall sharply. And when the wider economy is thriving, a company or even a country can still default on a bond. You can avoid concentration risk by having a diversified portfolio, reducing the chance of your overall investments underperforming or losing money.
Global diversification is something which is important and relevant for all investors, doesn't matter where they live. But it's even more important in a country like South Africa, whose GDP represents less than 1% of the global GDP. Furthermore, we find that there are many sectors or industries that are available worldwide which are not represented in South Africa. So unless one actually moves to other countries, to other asset classes, and then specifically to other sectors, you just don't get the nice level of diversification in your investments that you would have just in your home market.
Avoiding concentration risk is not the only benefit of diversification. Staying diversified will create a smoother ride towards your goals. Picture 3 jagged lines, representing 3 different kinds of asset. If you were to hold just one of those assets in your portfolio, you could expect a bumpy ride. But if you bundle the 3 together, the ups and downs are much less pronounced. One reason for this is that when one type of asset zigs, another often zags. Equities and bonds, for example, are broadly speaking negatively correlated.
Ultimately, risk is a very personal matter. A portfolio that might be cautious to one investor may be highly risky for another. No one should take on more risk than they are comfortable to take, need to take, and can afford to take. Regardless of your risk appetite, you need to ensure that your portfolio remains diversified. So far, we've touched on 3 different types of investing. We've learned how the evidence points to avoiding active managed funds and perhaps instead investing in passive funds or funds that capture returns from specific market risks, or a combination of both. We've also seen the importance of matching your portfolio to your capacity for risk. Ultimately, your success as an investor is entirely up to you.
So I think fear and greed are probably the biggest driver of investment decisions. And the thing is, it is the most detrimental impact on creating wealth, because what is happening is all your investment decisions are being driven by emotion and not by fact. So what we see is that people want to enter the market when they hear other people have made money. So everyone's drawn to those high returns, and that usually indicates the top of a market. It usually means things are getting a little bit expensive. But then when there's doom on the gloom on the ground, possibly an opportunity to buy, people don't want to ever invest. And I think that is the problem. It's when there's a lot of money that's being made, there's greed and everybody wants to go in, indicating high in the market, and again exiting when the markets are weak. And this develops into what we call the behavior gap. So this is when the market return is actually higher than what the average investor is getting. So a large fund manager in South Africa actually did a study over 10 years where they looked at the return from the fund and then they looked at the return of the average investor. And they determined that over those 10 years, the average investor earned 2.3% less per annum than the fund had actually returned, because the investor kept going in and out of the markets. And that over a 10-year period resulted in over 20% loss for the investor. So again, that idea of market timing can really, really undermine your investment outcome. And I always think when you're driving, when you're on the highway and you're stuck in a traffic jam and the lane next to you starts moving and you think, oh, let me quickly move into that lane, it's going faster. And the minute you do that, the lane that you move into stops and the lane you were in starts going. And I think that's a fantastic analogy about how investors mistake market timing and destroy their wealth.
Thanks so much, sis. It's because the returns you end up with depend so heavily on your behavior that self-awareness becomes so important. Understanding your own personality, what your goals are, and which biases you're particularly prone to will help you manage this behavior in the years to come.
When investors make long-term investment decisions, their tolerance for markets rising or falling is a factor that they need to consider. They can't invest all their money in shares if they can't tolerate a 5% drop in the value of their portfolio. So it's certainly a factor that they need to take care of, but at the same time, they need to look at what their overall financial planning requires. All investors over a 5 or 10 year period will need exposure to shares, but it's the quantum of shares that becomes relevant.
A constant temptation investors face is to try to time the market, but it's almost impossible to do successfully. Between the two world wars, the bursar of King's College, Cambridge, and the man responsible for the college's investment strategy was the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. He tried to get into the market when prices were about to rise and out again before they fell. But even he missed the most infamous market crash of all.
Keynes ran portfolios both for himself and for his college amongst other investors for about a quarter of a century. And one of the key things that he learnt about investing was the great difficulty, or indeed the futility, of market timing. So by market timing, what we mean is trying to pick the points when you should be in or out of the equity market, as opposed to being in bonds or cash, for example, because those were the three major asset classes that were available to him, in addition to property in the 20s and the 30s. He pored over economic and industrial statistics, and indeed he founded the premier economic and statistical service of its day. Despite all those advantages, as well as being a great economist, he found it very difficult to time when to get in and when to get out of the equity market. And probably the prime example of that is that in October 1929, when the London stock market crashed, along with New York, he was still very heavily into equities.
As investors, we're subject to many behavioral biases, and one of them is trying to time the market. We want to pick the best time to get in and the best time to get out. At Morningstar, we have done a lot of work around the futility of trying to time the market. We think it's really luck, it's not skill. Warren Buffett coined the term time in the market is better than timing the market. And the work we did at Morningstar showed that of a period of 5,862 days, when you could have been invested. As an investor, you would have made a return of around 14% per annum. That's a very good return. That's a very healthy real return. We then looked at what would happen if you had missed just the best 25 days of that 5,800 odd days that you could have been invested. If you'd missed just the best 25 days, your return halved. You got a return of 7%, which is materially different to 14%. In fact, it's just above inflation. Another interesting point we found was that sometimes the best days came directly after or very close to the worst days. So as investors, if we had sat there out of the market when the worst day happened, it's very unlikely that we would have put our money in and captured the best day.
You'll often see in the media industry experts speculating about the likely impact on markets of major political events like referendums and general elections. But almost invariably, it's at times such as these that your portfolio should be left exactly as it is.
Politicians and the role that they play in markets should be a very small part of your decision making when you make investment decisions. All investors around the world tend to overemphasize the role of a president or a new political party, and unless they're going to be radical in their policies, that should be a tiny factor in your decision making. Focus on your long-term goals, your long-term decisions, and ignore the political noise. The politicians come and go, the markets remain.
So don't get caught up in the headlines and the news, because for every market guru out there with an opinion, there's a counter opinion. So rather select an investment strategy that actually meets your investment needs and stick with it rather than trying to second guess those markets.
In fact, human beings are hardwired to make poor investment decisions. When markets soar, the reflexive nucleus accumbens fires up at the back of the brain's frontal lobe, and we instinctively want to buy. But when the markets tumble, our brain's amygdala floods our bloodstream with corticosterone. Fear kicks in, and we are overwhelmed by the urge to sell. Indeed, it's during a crash or market correction that investors tend to make their biggest mistakes.
We often differentiate between the risk that you need to take on versus the risk that you're able to stomach in terms of investments. And we know for long-term investments, we really need to be exposed to equities, to volatile investment conditions. But being able to stomach that can be very tough for some people. So I like to think of myself on being on a boat where there's quite unevenness, quite a bit of volatility in the sea around me. And the best way to deal with that is not to look down and look at the very stormy waters below me, but rather to look further out, look towards the investment horizon, get out on deck and actually feel that cool breeze on your face. That helps you to focus on your goal, to focus on where you are going with your investments and almost ignore the noise that is immediately below us.
Stock markets have always been prone to periods of extreme volatility, and always will be. We can't predict how we'll react until we find ourselves in just that sort of situation.
The important thing is to be prepared, understand how markets work, understand your plan, and most of all, understand yourself. The greatest threat to your success as an investor is you. Your temperament and approach to investing has a crucial role to play if you're going to meet your financial goals. Next, we explore the value of financial advice. You may be thinking, you now know enough to manage your finances on your own.
But everybody can benefit from good financial advice, even those who understand investing inside out. Thank you, Mama Fel.
Thank you.
I use a financial planner, even though I've got all the experience in the world and I don't need them to run money, because I value them helping me articulate what I need to do, helping me to account for the things that I say are important, and also being there if anything happens to me, my wife knows the number to call to help her.
An advisor's role as financial coach should not be underestimated. Advisors add value in many ways. And no, it's not by selecting alpha fund managers. Setting your financial plan and staying the course is key.
The biggest risk for investors is really the inability to live their desired lifestyle when they retire. As in, their savings don't match their required income needs, their inability to meet their financial goals. What we found with investment advisors in South Africa is historically they have been investment pickers. They've tried to pick the best funds or the winning funds over time. But really the work that Morningstar has done is that financial advisors add huge value as financial coaches. What do we mean by a financial coach? Well, a paper produced by David Blanchett within Morningstar looked at the value within the investment chain. You've got alpha, which is the returns that you generate above the market. You have beta, which is the returns you generate in the market. And then they termed a coin gamma, which is the value of advice. And the gamma that is added over time equates to around 1.5% per year. Now that may seem small in absolute terms, but if you compound that, it is a very large number. So where does that value of advice come from? It comes from advisors keeping investors invested, getting them to stay the course. We all know that markets are volatile, and we know when we invest that there are going to be times they're going to feel uncomfortable. But it's when they're uncomfortable that as investors we want to do something. We're our own worst enemy. We want to disinvest, we want to move to money market, we want to make a change. When actually the best advice you can get from your financial advisor is to sit on your hands. If your goal hasn't changed, then your strategy shouldn't.
Low-cost index funds are now a key way for financial advisors to execute on an investment plan.
The role of a financial advisor in the context of a client's financial life is changing. The old way of focusing on delivering value to a client through manager selection, through trying to find outperformance, is dying, and rightly so. In reality, what we were all trying to do was looking for managers to deliver an extra 10% to the client's return, rather than really focusing on asset allocation, which delivers the vast majority of the return to clients. This is one of the benefits of index funds now, is that the focus can be placed away from manager selection and more towards asset allocation. And in reality, if you think about it, asset allocation gives the vast majority of client returns. The second, and perhaps the more tangible focus for clients, is the reduction in cost. And in reality, the reduction in cost can add 20, 30, sometimes 40% to the value of a client's retirement over long investment time horizons. That is a huge impact on clients. So I think if you add those two together, really those have a material impact on the end client from the point of view of a financial advisor.
However, now that we know that an evidence-based approach is more likely going to help you reach your investment goals, but a large portion of your portfolio isn't being passively managed, isn't it time you speak to your financial advisor? Our journey of discovery, unpacking the truths of investing, is nearly over. But I thought I'd take one final stop and visit one of the firms making evidence-based investing an everyday reality.
Hi, welcome. We've chosen to take an evidence-based approach to putting our funds together. Those funds are low-cost index funds and ETFs, which track different markets and indices around the world. We've also got a range of factor strategies, harnessing the different evidence that we have around factor investing.
As one aims to accumulate wealth, CoreShares follows a systematic approach to asset class allocation, ensuring a suitable weighting to growth assets to reach the goal of maximizing returns ahead of retirement. And then, when in retirement, the combination of asset classes changes to meet the new goal of a reliable and growing income stream. In both cases, CoreShares aims to achieve these goals with a high level of predictability.
As we approach the investment challenge, we try to stay true to the evidence-based framework. So that's around being systematic in terms of how we approach things, sticking to the maths, backing the maths, ensuring that we're working with timeframes correctly, being humble actually in terms of what we know and what we don't know.
An evidence-based approach has two legs to it. Firstly, understanding which key elements are most relevant to the problem at hand, and then ensuring that the evidence used is robust. When assessing the evidence, CoreShares ensures that it's research-based, rational and repeatable, and lastly, applicable.
We typically look for evidence which is research-based, That research should be independent, typically would be academic in nature, is cited and peer-reviewed, and often published by credible journals. In addition to that, we look for research which is rational and repeatable. That rationale should be from both an economic perspective as well as a behavioral finance rationale perspective. And the repeatability of the research and the evidence usually relates to statistical significance in the empirical findings of the research. And then importantly, it should be applicable. It should be applicable in terms of the investability of the evidence that we have found, specifically for our investors in the local market.
So what are the key pieces of evidence underpinning the CoreShares product range? There are 4 key areas, starting with the returns one can expect from the different asset classes through time.
Through time, investors can expect lower volatility from defensive assets like bonds and higher returns from risk assets like equities.
We've seen that by keeping costs low, this benefit compounds through time.
Multiple studies from S&P, Morningstar and academia have shown that an investment product's costs are so important that they are the largest predictor of a fund's future success.
Diversification has an important role to play when managing risk.
This relationship between diversification and risk is so important that Harry Markowitz, a Nobel Prize winning economist, declared diversification to be the only free lunch in investing.
And lastly, the additional return available from factors.
We use factor investing to give clients risk-adjusted outperformance relative to the market through time, or in specific use cases like dividend strategies.
When clients impart their money to a money manager, they are looking to us to execute our responsibility with the most amount of skill possible, with professionalism, and with a great deal of fiduciary responsibility. So the question is, how do we discharge that fiduciary responsibility? And that's not through guesswork. It's through using an evidence-based investment framework. And by doing that, we find that we're able to improve communication with the client, we're able to build better trust with the client, and importantly, we're able to build more predictable outcomes.
At the start of our journey, I asked the question, how do we give ourselves the very best chance of achieving our financial goals?
In short, it takes 2 things. First, setting your investment approach, preferably a low-cost, evidence-based portfolio that matches your investment objectives. And secondly, as John Bogle would say, stay the course.